At 6 a.m. on May 24th, 1941, the North Atlantic was not just an ocean. It was a grave. The sun was barely rising over the Denmark Strait, casting a cold, gray light on the freezing water. Two Royal Navy ships, the HMS Hood and the HMS Prince of Wales, were racing to intercept a shadow. They were hunting the ultimate nightmare of the British Admiralty. They were hunting the Bismarck. For days, the rumors had been flying through the intelligence networks. The German battleship had left port. It was breaking out into the Atlantic. If the Bismarck reached the open ocean, it would sever the lifeline between America and Britain. It would hunt the supply convoys at will. It would starve the island nation into submission. Winston Churchill had issued a command that was 3 words long and written in blood. Sink the Bismarck. The HMS Hood was the pride of the Royal Navy. It was the biggest battlecruiser in the world, a symbol of British imperial power that had sailed the oceans for 20 years. The crew of the Hood felt invincible. They had the tonnage. They had the guns. They had the history. At 6:01 a.m., history stopped mattering. From 14 miles away, the Bismarck opened fire. Its massive 15-inch guns roared. The shells weighed nearly 2,000 pounds each. They arched through the gray sky, screaming like banshees. The first salvo was a bracketing shot. The second salvo was a direct hit. One single German shell plunged through the deck armor of the HMS Hood. It smashed into the aft magazine, where hundreds of tons of cordite and artillery shells were stored. The result was not an explosion. It was a vaporization. A column of fire, orange and black, shot 3,000 feet into the air. The back of the ship was simply erased. The mighty battlecruiser snapped in half like a dry twig. In 3 minutes, the Hood was gone. Out of a crew of 1,418 men, only 3 survived. 3. The shockwave of that explosion did not just rock the ocean, it rocked the world. In London, the Admiralty was in a state of absolute panic. The Hood was invincible. The Hood was the shield, and the Bismarck had just swatted it aside like a fly. Now, the German monster was loose. The Bismarck turned south, heading for the safety of the French coast. It was damaged, yes, a fuel tank had been hit, but it was still lethal. And it was fast. The Bismarck could do 30 knots. It was faster than the British battleships chasing it. It was outrunning the vengeance of the Royal Navy. The British threw everything they had at it. They stripped the convoys of their escorts. They pulled ships from Gibraltar. They sent cruisers, destroyers, and carriers. It was the greatest naval hunt in human history. Every available ship in the North Atlantic was turning its bow toward the Bismarck's last known position. But there was a problem, a math problem. The Bismarck was too far ahead. The British battleships, the King George V and the Rodney, were too slow to catch it. The cruisers were running low on fuel. The Bismarck was closing the gap to the umbrella of the Luftwaffe. Once it got within range of German air cover from France, it would be safe. The British had maybe 24 hours to stop the most powerful warship on Earth. And if they failed, the war in the Atlantic was lost. They needed to slow it down. They needed a miracle. On the heaving deck of the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, that miracle was being wheeled out of the hangar. But it did not look like a miracle. It looked like a museum exhibit. It was the Fairey Swordfish. To look at the Swordfish in 1941 was to look at a joke. It was a biplane. It had 2 wings stacked on top of each other, held together by metal struts and bracing wires. It was covered in fabric, literally Irish linen doped with varnish. It had an open cockpit where the pilot, the observer, and the gunner sat exposed to the freezing wind and the rain. It had a fixed landing gear that could not retract, dangling underneath it like the legs of a dead bird. The pilots called it the Stringbag. It was a reference to the mesh shopping bags British housewives used, which could hold any shape of groceries. The Swordfish was ugly. It was archaic, and it was agonizingly slow. Its top speed, with a tailwind and the engines screaming, was about 140 miles per hour. With a torpedo strapped underneath, it struggled to hit 100. Cars drove faster than this plane flew. Contrasting the Swordfish with the Bismarck was almost cruel. The Bismarck was the pinnacle of Nazi engineering. It was an all-steel Leviathan protected by the Wotan armor plating, a hardened steel alloy that was virtually impenetrable. It bristled with anti-aircraft guns. It had advanced fire control computers. It had radar-guided batteries. It was designed to fight the battleships of the future. The Swordfish was designed in the early 1930s. It did not have a radio that worked half the time. It did not have a heater. It did not have armor. The crew wrapped themselves in wool sweaters and leather coats just to keep from freezing to death. It was a flying tent armed with a single torpedo that looked like it was left over from World War I. And yet, on the night of May 26, 1941, this flying tent was the last hope of the British Empire. The weather was apocalyptic. A full gale was blowing across the Atlantic. The deck of the Ark Royal was pitching up and down by 60 feet. The wind was gusting at 50 knots. Rain and hail were lashing the flight deck. In these conditions, you do not fly airplanes. You tie them down and pray they do not wash overboard. But the order came down from the bridge. Launch the strike. 15 Swordfish pilots climbed into their open cockpits. They looked at the gray wall of rain ahead of them. They looked at the torpedoes strapped to the bellies of their fragile planes. They knew the odds. They were going to fly into the teeth of a storm, find a single ship in a massive ocean, and attack the most heavily defended fortress afloat. The deck crews wrestled the planes into position. The wind was so strong it threatened to flip the biplanes over before the engines even started. The Pegasus engines sputtered to life, spitting blue smoke. One by one, the stringbags rolled down the heaving deck. They did not take off. They were practically thrown into the air by the motion of the ship. They clawed for altitude, disappearing into the low clouds, heading south into the gloom. Inside the lead plane, Lieutenant Commander John Moffett gripped the control stick. He could not see the horizon. He was flying on instruments, fighting the turbulence that tossed his light plane around like a leaf. The rain felt like gravel hitting his face. He checked his compass. He checked his fuel. He thought about the Bismarck. He thought about the Hood. He thought about the thousands of sailors who had died that morning. He knew that the German gunners on the Bismarck were waiting. They were manning the flak towers. They had 37mm autocannons. They had 20mm quads. They had the massive 15-inch main guns that could be used to splash water into the air to knock planes down. Moffett knew that his plane was made of canvas. One incendiary bullet would turn it into a torch. One piece of shrapnel would shred the wings. He was flying a kite into a blast furnace. But Moffett also knew something else. He knew the Swordfish had a secret. It was not technology. It was not speed. It was the fact that it should not be there at all. The Bismarck was a machine of logic. It was built to fight other machines of logic. It was built to track fast monoplanes, to calculate lead angles based on high-speed intercepts. It was not built to fight a ghost from the previous war. It was not built to fight a plane that flew so slowly that the fire control computers could not process the math. As the squadron broke through the clouds, the sea below was a churning cauldron of white foam. And there, in the distance, was the dark shape. The Beast. It was plowing through the waves, its massive guns trained fore and aft. The Bismarck spotted them. The alarm klaxon screamed throughout the German ship. Fliegeralarm! Torpedo aircraft! The German gunners swung their weapons around. They looked through their sights. They saw the biplanes drifting toward them like lazy insects. They laughed. This was going to be a turkey shoot. They were going to swat these gnats out of the sky before they could get within a mile. But the laughter was about to die in their throats. Because the Stringbag was about to prove that in war, sometimes the most dangerous weapon is not the one with the most horsepower. Sometimes, the most dangerous weapon is the one that is too stupid to know it's supposed to lose. The pilots pushed their throttles forward. The Swordfish dropped toward the wave tops. The canvas wings fluttered. The wires hummed. The hunt was on. And the Bismarck, the invincible giant, was about to find out that it had an Achilles heel, and the arrow was made of Irish linen. The storm over the Atlantic was getting worse. The cloud ceiling had dropped to 700 feet. The wind was howling at gale force, whipping the tops of the waves into a frothing white frenzy. Inside the open cockpit of his Fairey Swordfish, Lieutenant Commander John Moffett was fighting a wrestling match with his own airplane. The control stick kicked and bucked in his hands. The fabric wings groaned under the strain. He was soaking wet, freezing cold, and flying a museum piece into the most lethal airspace on the planet. But before they could kill the Bismarck, the Swordfish pilots almost committed the greatest blunder of the naval war. Radar contact. A blip on the screen. A massive ship in the darkness below. The squadron leader signaled the attack. The Swordfish dived through the clouds, their wires screaming in the wind. They saw the gray hull. They saw the wake. They leveled out at wave top height, the classic torpedo bomber approach. They pressed the release buttons. The 18-inch torpedoes dropped into the water and began their run. It was a textbook attack. There was only one problem. The ship was not the Bismarck. It was the HMS Sheffield. The Sheffield was a British cruiser that had been sent ahead to shadow the German battleship. Nobody had told the pilots. They were attacking their own ship, but the captain of the Sheffield looked up and saw the distinctive double wings of the Swordfish. He did not fire back. He knew they were friendly. He slammed his engines into full emergency power and turned the ship hard to starboard, combing the tracks of the torpedoes. It was a disaster in the making. But then, a miracle of incompetence saved them. The torpedoes exploded, not against the ship, but in the open water. The magnetic detonators, the high-tech fuses designed to detect the steel hull of a ship and explode beneath it, were defective. The rough seas set them off prematurely. The fish detonated harmlessly before they even reached the Sheffield. The Swordfish pilots realized their mistake with horror. They climbed away, shame burning in their chests. They had almost killed their own brothers. But in that failure lay the seeds of victory. If they had attacked the Bismarck with those magnetic detonators, the torpedoes would have exploded early, and the German giant would have sailed away laughing. They flew back to the carrier Ark Royal. They landed on the heaving deck, a feat of airmanship that terrified the deck crews. They rearmed. They switched the detonators. No more fancy magnetic tech. They put on contact fuses, the old-fashioned kind. The kind that had to physically smash into the steel to go off. It was a primitive solution for a primitive plane. The sun was setting. The fuel was low. This was it. One last roll of the dice. The squadron took off again into the gathering twilight. The weather was now suicidal. The clouds were solid down to the water. The pilots were flying blindly, relying on the observer in the back seat to read the radar. Target ahead! 12 miles! This time, there was no mistake. The Bismarck was there. And the Bismarck was angry. The German battleship erupted. It did not just fire its anti-aircraft guns. It fired everything. The massive 15-inch main battery guns, weapons designed to sink battleships 10 miles away, were depressed to point-blank range. They fired into the sea in front of the approaching planes. The shells exploded on impact with the water, sending up walls of water hundreds of feet high. The Germans were trying to create a physical barrier of splash and steel to swat the biplanes out of the air. It was like flying into a washing machine filled with grenades. The air was filled with black smoke, white water, and the red streaks of tracer fire. And this is where the Swordfish paradox happened. The German fire control computers were the most advanced in the world. They were analog masterpieces of engineering. They used radar data and optical tracking to to calculate the speed and trajectory of an enemy aircraft, compute the lead, how far ahead to aim, and automatically slew the guns. But the engineers at Krupp and Siemens had made an assumption. They assumed the enemy would be flying a modern aircraft. They assumed a target speed of at least 250 miles per hour. The Swordfish was flying at 85 knots. It was flying into a 40-knot headwind. Its ground speed was barely 50 miles per hour. The German computers could not handle it. The math broke. The guns were tracking too fast. The shells were exploding far in front of the biplanes. The German gunners, disciplined and trained, followed their instruments. They kept aiming where the computer told them the plane should be. But the plane was not there yet. The Swordfish was so slow, it was dodging bullets by simply not arriving on time. The fabric skin of the Swordfish played a part too. The modern German anti-aircraft shells were fused to explode on contact with metal. When they punched through the canvas wings of the biplanes, they often did not detonate. They just poked a neat hole and kept going. The Swordfish were flying through a storm of steel, collecting holes, but refusing to die. Lieutenant Commander Moffett picked his angle. He was coming in from the port side. He dropped down to 50 feet. The spray from the waves was hitting his landing gear. The noise was deafening. The roar of his own engine, the scream of the wind, and the terrifying crump of the 15-inch shells exploding nearby. He looked over his shoulder. His observer was huddled in the cockpit, calling out the range. His rear gunner was sitting backward, facing the German battleship, gripping his single machine gun. Think about the courage of that gunner. He is sitting in a wicker chair, looking directly down the barrels of a battleship, with nothing to do but watch death approach. 2,000 yards! Moffett had to get closer. If he dropped the torpedo now, the Bismarck would just turn and comb the track. He had to be point blank. 1,500 yards! The tracers were getting closer. He could see the individual rivets on the Bismarck's hull. He could see the flashes of the guns. The turbulence was tossing the plane like a toy. He wrestled the stick, trying to keep the wings level. A torpedo drop requires a steady platform. If the wings are dipped, the torpedo dives deep and hits the bottom. 1,000 yards! This was suicide range. The automatic cannons on the Bismarck were chewing up the air around him. Moffett kicked the rudder. He lined up the nose. He aimed not at the ship, but ahead of it, leading the target. Letting go! He yanked the release lever. The plane lurched upward, relieved of the 1,600-pound weight. Moffett did not wait to see the splash. He slammed the throttle forward and banked hard to the left, diving into the trough of a wave to hide from the gunners. He flew away with his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the boom. The torpedo ran true. It was a Mark 12 torpedo, a weapon that had been obsolete for years. It chugged through the water at a leisurely 40 knots. On the bridge of the Bismarck, the captain ordered a hard turn to starboard. He saw the wake of the torpedo coming. The massive ship leaned into the turn. The torpedo passed harmlessly by the bow. No, another Swordfish, flying from a different angle, had dropped its fish. The first torpedo hit the armor belt amidships. It exploded with a dull thud. The Wotan armor laughed it off. A scratch on the paint. The German officers breathed a sigh of relief. The primitive attack had failed, but they forgot about Moffett's torpedo. It was trailing behind. It was heading for the stern. The Bismarck was in the middle of a hard turn, its stern swinging out. The torpedo struck. It did not hit the thick armor belt. It hit the weakest part of the ship. It slammed into the steering gear compartment. The explosion was massive. It blew a hole in the hull. It twisted the heavy steel frames. But most importantly, it jammed the massive twin rudders. The rudders were locked at 12 degrees to port. On the bridge, the helmsman spun the wheel. Nothing happened. "Rudder is not responding," he screamed. The captain ordered counterflooding. He ordered the engines to be run at different speeds to steer the ship. It did not work. The force of the jammed rudders was too great. The Bismarck, the 50,000-ton pride of the Third Reich, began to turn in a slow, inexorable circle. It was heading northwest. It was heading straight toward the British battleships Rodney and King George V. The wind had shifted. The hunter was now the prey. High above, in the darkness, John Moffat circled. He did not know if he had hit. He just knew he was alive. He turned his battered, hole-punched biplane back toward the Ark Royal. He did not know that he had just delivered the Golden BB, the 1-in-a-million shot that changes the course of history. Back in London, the radio intercepts started coming in. The Bismarck was signaling Berlin. The tone of the messages had changed. They were not arrogant anymore. They were desperate. Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer. Churchill read the message. He took the cigar out of his mouth. The Stringbag had done it. The following morning, the British battleships arrived. The Bismarck was circling, helplessly, unable to aim its guns effectively because it could not steer. It was a slaughter. The Rodney and the King George V closed to point-blank range and pounded the German giant into scrap metal. They fired over 2,800 shells. The Bismarck burned, capsized, and sank, taking 2,000 men to the bottom. But the British battleships were just the executioners. The judge and jury was a biplane made of Irish linen. The story of the Swordfish is the ultimate underdog story. In an era where everyone was obsessed with bigger engines, thicker armor, and faster speeds, the Swordfish proved that technology is not the only factor in war. It proved that a weapon is only obsolete if you use it wrong. The Germans had radar. They had computers. They had jet engines on the drawing board. But they did not have an answer for a canvas kite flown by men with ice water in their veins. The Bismarck was sunk by a paradox. It was too advanced for its own good. It was designed to fight the future, so it was killed by the past. John Moffat survived the war. He lived to be 97 years old. For the rest of his life, he kept a piece of fabric in his wallet. It was a scrap of linen from a swordfish wing. Whenever someone told him that something was impossible, that the odds were too high, that the technology was not ready, he would just touch that piece of cloth and smile. He knew that impossible is just a word used by people who have not tried flying a biplane into a hurricane. The Swordfish stayed in service until the very end of the war. In fact, it outlived the plane that was supposed to replace it. It sank more tonnage of Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft. It operated in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Arctic. It carried rockets, bombs, and depth charges. It was the Stringbag. It could carry anything, including the fate of the free world. If this story of the biplane that killed a battleship blew your mind, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that you want more stories about the machines that defied the odds. Check your subscription. Are you locked in? We are digging through the archives every week to find the legends that history tried to forget. And I want to know. Drop your city and state in the comments. Let's see where the Patriots are watching from. Would you have climbed into that open cockpit in a gale? Let me know below. I'll see you in the next one. Keep your wings level. To understand the sheer absurdity of the Swordfish's career, you have to look at the date. November 11th, 1940. This was 6 months before the hunt for the Bismarck. The world still believed that battleships were the kings of the ocean. The prevailing wisdom among admirals, men with gold braid on their sleeves and decades of experience, was that a fleet anchored in a protected harbor was invincible. They believed that torpedo nets, barrage balloons, and shore batteries made a port impenetrable to air attack. The Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, felt safe. They had parked their entire battle fleet in the harbor of Taranto, in the heel of the Italian boot. 6 battleships, 7 heavy cruisers, and destroyers galore. It was a forest of steel masts and heavy guns. It was the most heavily defended harbor in the Mediterranean. The British Mediterranean fleet was outnumbered. They were losing the war for the sea lanes. They needed to knock the Italians out, but they could not risk a ship-to-ship battle against those numbers. So Admiral Andrew Cunningham decided to try something that had never been done before. He decided to send in the Stringbags. The plan was insanity on paper. Launch 21 slow, fabric-covered biplanes from an aircraft carrier at night. Fly them 170 miles across open water. Dodge a ring of barrage balloons. Fly through a wall of anti-aircraft fire. And drop torpedoes in a harbor that was only 40 feet deep. That last part was the kicker. Standard torpedoes need depth. When you drop a 1,600-pound torpedo from a plane, it dives deep, usually about 100 feet, before the hydrostatic valves level it out. If you drop a standard torpedo in Taranto harbor, it does not hit a ship. It hits the mud. It gets stuck in the bottom like a lawn dart. The Italians knew this. That's why they felt safe. They did not even bother putting up torpedo nets all the way to the bottom. They thought the physics of the ocean protected them. But the British engineers at Fairey were not interested in Italian physics. They invented a workaround. They attached a wire lanyard to the nose of the torpedo and the tail of the plane. When the torpedo dropped, the wire pulled the nose up, forcing the fish to belly flop onto the water flat. It was a belly flop modification. It looked crude. It looked stupid. But it meant the torpedo would only dive to 30 feet. On the night of the attack, the HMS Illustrious launched 2 waves of swordfish. The weather, as usual for the Royal Navy, was garbage. Clouds, rain, and darkness. The lead swordfish were not carrying torpedoes. They were carrying flares. Their job was to act as illuminators. They had to fly over the harbor, while Italian gunners shot everything they had at them, and drop magnesium flares to light up the silhouettes of the battleships for the torpedo bombers coming in behind them. Imagine being that pilot. You are flying a kite at 80 miles per hour. You turn on the lights in a dark room full of people holding shotguns. And then you just circle, waiting for your friends to do the work. The first wave went in. The flares popped, bathing the harbor in an eerie white light. The Italian gunners were stunned. They filled the sky with tracers. Taranto became a volcano of fire. The swordfish pilots dove. They had to thread the needle between the barrage balloons. These were massive gas bags, tethered with steel cables designed to slice the wings off airplanes. The pilots were flying so low, their wheels were almost touching the water. They flew under the cables. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth Williamson lined up on the battleship Conte de Cavour. He flew straight into the mouth of the guns. He dropped his torpedo at point-blank range. The fish hit the water, belly flopped perfectly, ran true, and blew a 27-foot hole in the Italian flagship. Behind him, other swordfish were hunting the Littorio and the Caio Duilio. The harbor was chaos. Smoke, fire, and the roar of Pegasus engines. In less than an hour, 21 biplanes had destroyed half of the Italian battle fleet. They sank 1 battleship and heavily damaged 2 others. They shifted the balance of power in the Mediterranean in a single night. The British lost 2 planes. 2. The next morning, the Italian admiral looked out at his burning fleet. He was in shock. The age of the battleship had ended, and the executioner was a biplane. But there was someone else watching Taranto with great interest. In the Japanese embassy in Rome, a naval attaché named Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito immediately flew to Taranto. He interviewed the survivors. He studied the torpedo drop patterns. He took copious notes on the shallow water modifications. He sent a detailed report back to Tokyo. A year later, Admiral Yamamoto would use that report to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Swordfish did not just win a battle, it wrote the textbook for the Pacific War. But if Taranto was the Swordfish's moment of tactical genius, the Channel Dash was its moment of tragic glory. This is the story that proved that the men who flew these planes were not just skilled. They were made of something harder than the steel they fought against. February 1942. The Germans decided to move their heavy ships, the battlecruiser Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, from France back to Germany. They planned a brazen dash right up the English Channel, right under the nose of the British Dover defenses. It was called Operation Cerberus. The British were caught flat-footed. Their radar was jammed. Their communication broke down. By the time they realized the German fleet was in the channel, the ships were moving fast, protected by hundreds of Luftwaffe fighters and E-boats. The only aircraft available to stop them were 6 Fairey Swordfish from 825 Naval Air Squadron, stationed at Manston. 6 biplanes. Against 3 capital ships, 6 destroyers, 40 torpedo boats, and over 200 Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s. The squadron commander was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond. He had flown against the Bismarck. He knew what flak looked like. He looked at his orders. He looked at his pilots. He knew it was a suicide mission. There was no other way to describe it. Flying a 100 miles per hour biplane against the entire Luftwaffe air cover in broad daylight was death. He did not order his men to go. He volunteered. And every single crew member stepped forward with him. They took off at 12:25 p.m. They formed a diamond formation. As soon as they crossed the coast, the hell started. The German fighter pilots could not believe their eyes. They saw 6 archaic biplanes plodding toward the fleet. It looked like a historical reenactment. The Messerschmitts dove. They slashed through the formation. The rear gunners and the Swordfish fought back with their single Lewis guns, but it was hopeless. The fabric wings were shredded. The fuselages were riddled with cannon shells. But the Swordfish did not turn back. They kept flying. They were burning. They were falling apart, but they held their course. Esmond's plane was hit by a flak shell that blew away part of his lower left wing. He kept flying. He was attacked by 2 109s that set his engine on fire. He kept flying. He closed to within 3,000 yards of the Scharnhorst. He flew through a wall of fire so dense that the German sailors later said it looked like a solid sheet of flame. He dropped his torpedo. Moments later, his plane disintegrated, crashing into the icy sea. The other 5 Swordfish followed him into the fire. One by one, they were swatted out of the sky. All 6 planes were destroyed. Only 5 men out of 18 survived the crash and the freezing water. They did not score a single hit. The German ships escaped, though they hit mines later. Tactically, it was a failure, but morally, it was legendary. The German Vice Admiral, Otto Ciliax, watching from the bridge of the Scharnhorst, was stunned. He wrote in his log, "The mothball attack of a handful of ancient planes, piloted by men whose bravery surpasses any other action by either side that I have seen." Think about that. A Nazi admiral, in the middle of a war, paused to write a eulogy for the men trying to kill him. He recognized that what he just saw was not war. It was sacrifice. Eugene Esmond was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. He had led the charge of the Light Brigade of the Air. These 2 events, Taranto and the Channel Dash, showed the duality of the Swordfish. It was a weapon of incredible cunning, capable of rewriting the rules of naval warfare. And it was a coffin of incredible heroism, flown by men who knew that their slow speed was a death sentence, but flew anyway. But the Swordfish was not done. The obsolete biplane had one more trick up its sleeve. The Admiralty realized that while the Swordfish was too slow to survive in the English Channel against fighters, it was perfect for a different kind of war. A war where speed did not matter, but loiter time did. The Battle of the Atlantic was turning. The U-boats were hunting in wolf packs in the mid-Atlantic air gap, the area where land-based bombers could not reach. The convoys were being slaughtered. The Allies needed air cover in the middle of the ocean. They did not have enough big aircraft carriers, so they improvised. They took oil tankers and grain ships, sliced the tops off, welded a flat steel deck over the hull, and called them MAC ships, merchant aircraft carriers. These decks were tiny. They were barely 400 feet long. They pitched and rolled in the Atlantic swell. A modern fighter like a Hurricane or a Seafire could not operate from them effectively. They needed a plane that could take off in a soccer field and land on a postage stamp. They needed the Stringbag. The Swordfish went back to work. But this was not the torpedo bomber anymore. This was a new beast. The engineers fitted it with ASV radar, one of the first airborne surface search radars. They painted it white to blend in with the Atlantic clouds. And they gave it a new weapon: rockets. Under the lower wings, they installed steel rails carrying 60-pound RP-3 rockets. These were not guided missiles. They were solid fuel iron bars with high explosive warheads. They were dumb weapons, but against a U-boat, they were terrifying. A U-boat on the surface has a thick pressure hull, but it is vulnerable to puncture. If you hit it with a machine gun, it bounces off. If you hit it with a bomb, you have to be precise. But a rocket has a shaped charge. It punches a hole right through the steel. The Swordfish pilots developed a new tactic. They would patrol for hours in the freezing cold, waiting for a radar blip. When they found a sub, they did not dive fast. They could not. They spiraled down silently. The wind in the wires masked the engine noise. By the time the U-boat lookouts saw the white biplane, it was too late. The pilot would fire a salvo of rockets. The water around the sub would boil. If a rocket hit the hole, it was game over. The U-boat could not dive. It was forced to surface and fight it out, or sink. The obsolete Swordfish became the deadliest submarine killer of the war. It sank 14 U-boats personally, and shared credit for many more. It operated from decks that were awash with green water, in storms that grounded the real Air Force. It protected the convoys that kept Britain alive. It flew until the very last day of the war. On VE Day, while the jets were flying over Berlin and the atomic bomb was being prepped for Japan, the Royal Navy still had Swordfish on active duty. It outlived the replacement plane, the Albacore, that was designed to supersede it. It outlived the ships it was designed to protect. It outlived the expectations of every expert on Earth. Why? Because in a war of high-tech specialization, the Stringbag was the ultimate generalist. It could carry a torpedo, a mine, a bomb, a flare, a rocket, or a crate of beer. It could fly from a carrier, a battleship, a merchant ship, or a beach. It could fly in weather that grounded birds. It could take damage that would disintegrate a metal plane. It was the Toyota Hilux of World War II. Ugly, slow, indestructible, and absolutely essential. So, when we talk about the great aircraft of the war, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the B-17, we need to save a seat at the table for the biplane. Because without the Swordfish, the Bismarck might have escaped. Without the Swordfish, Pearl Harbor might never have happened, strategically speaking. Without the Swordfish, the Atlantic convoys might have starved. It was the plane that proved that obsolescence is just a state of mind. If this deep dive into the fabric-covered legend has you ready to build a biplane in your garage, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that speed is not everything. Check your subscription. Make sure you're locked in for the next history lesson. At dawn on February 12, 1942, the English Channel was a gray, freezing expanse of chop and fog. On the airfield at Manston, in Kent, the engines of 18 Fairey Swordfish were turning over. But the mood was not professional. It was funereal. The pilots of the 825 Naval Air Squadron were not checking their maps with the usual focus. They were writing letters. Last letters. They knew what was coming. The German fleet in being, the battlecruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen had broken out of Brest. They were making a run for Germany, right up the English Channel. It was a slap in the face to the British Empire. The Nazis were sailing their capital ships through Britain's front yard in broad daylight. The British response was a catastrophe of errors. The radar was jammed. The communication lines were cut. The coastal artillery was silent. The only thing standing between the German fleet and safety was Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmond in 6 biplanes. Esmond was a veteran. He had flown against the Bismarck. He knew what heavy flak looked like. But this was different. The German fleet was not alone. It was protected by Operation Thunderbolt, a massive umbrella of Luftwaffe fighters. Over 250 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s were circling the ships. Esmond was promised a fighter escort. 5 squadrons of Spitfires were supposed to meet him over the coast to clear a path. When the Swordfish formed up at 12:25 p.m., the sky was empty. The Spitfires had not arrived. There was a mix-up in the timing, a failure in the radio codes. Esmond circled Manston once. He looked at his watch. He looked at his fuel gauges. He knew that every second he waited, that the German ships were getting further away. So he had a choice. He could land. He could cite the lack of escort as a reason to scrub the mission. No court-martial in the world would convict him. It was suicide to fly a 100-mile-per-hour biplane against 200 modern fighters. Esmond did not land. He waved his hand. The 6 Swordfish turned east, toward the sea. 10 Spitfires eventually found them, just 10, but they were quickly engaged by the German fighter screen and pulled away into high-altitude dogfights. The Swordfish were alone. The German fleet appeared on the horizon like a city of steel. 3 massive capital ships, 6 destroyers, and 40 torpedo boats. And above them, the sky was black with German fighters. When the German pilots saw the Swordfish, they hesitated. They thought they were hallucinating. It looked like a spectral formation from the First World War. Why were these canvas kites flying into the teeth of the Luftwaffe? Then, the slaughter began. The Messerschmitts dove. They did not need to use complex tactics. They just lined up behind the slow-moving biplanes and opened fire. The first Swordfish to die was flying on Esmond's wing. A burst of 20mm cannon fire shredded the fabric of the lower wing. The struts collapsed. The plane folded in on itself and cartwheeled into the sea. There were no parachutes. You do not jump from 50 feet. Esmond kept flying. He was the tip of the spear. His rear gunner, a young man armed with a single .303 Lewis gun, was firing back at the swarm of fighters. It was a pop gun against cannons. The German pilots later reported that the rear gunner never stopped firing, even as the tail of the plane was being chewed to pieces. The flak from the ships opened up. It was not just anti-aircraft fire. The destroyers were using their main guns to splash water into the path of the planes. The air was a wall of shrapnel and spray. Esmond's plane was hit in the engine. Oil spewed over the windshield. He was flying blind. He wiped his goggles, leaned out into the freezing slipstream, and kept his course. He was now 3,000 yards from the Scharnhorst. A Focke-Wulf 190 came in for a head-on pass. It blew away the top of Esmond's main wing. The Swordfish shuddered. Most of the fabric was gone. The plane was flying on the spars, the wooden skeletons of the wings, but it was still flying. The Pegasus engine, coughing and dying, dragged the wreck closer to the target. 2,000 yards. Esmond dropped his torpedo. He aimed for the lead ship. A second later, a direct hit from a heavy flak shell vaporized the cockpit. The Swordfish ceased to be an airplane and became a falling collection of burning debris. It splashed into the cold gray water. Eugene Esmond was gone. But the other 5 were still coming. They had watched their commander die. They saw the wall of fire. They did not break formation. They did not turn back. They flew into the inferno. Swordfish number 2, piloted by Sub-Lieutenant Brian Rose, was hit in the fuel tank. The pilot was wounded in the back. The observer was dead. Rose managed to drop his torpedo before the engine seized. He ditched the plane in the water. He dragged himself into the rubber dinghy, bleeding into the freezing Atlantic, and watched the rest of his squadron die. Swordfish number 3, pilot Kingsmill. His engine was on fire. The upper port wing was shot away. He closed to 1,500 yards. He dropped his torpedo. As he turned away, the plane finally gave up the ghost. The engine fell off the mounts. He crashed. The second flight of 3 Swordfish, led by Lieutenant Thompson, disappeared into the smoke. Nobody saw them drop. Nobody saw them crash. They simply flew into the cloud of cordite and never came out. All crews were lost. The battle lasted less than 20 minutes. 6 planes, 18 men, 0 hits. The German ships sailed on, undamaged. Tactically, Operation Cerberus was a British failure. The Swordfish had failed to stop the fleet, but the reaction from the enemy tells a different story. On the bridge of the Gneisenau, the German officers lowered their binoculars. They were silent. They were hardened sailors. They had fought in the North Atlantic, and they had seen ships blow up, but they had never seen anything like this. Captain Fine of the Gneisenau turned to his executive officer. "Such bravery," he said, "is impossible to comprehend." They knew they were dead men when they took off, and yet they came. Admiral Ciliax, commanding the German squadron, wrote in his official report, "The mothball attack of a handful of ancient planes, piloted by men whose bravery surpasses any other action by either side that I have seen. It was the charge of the Light Brigade with propellers. It was the moment the Swordfish transcended its physical form. It was not a stringbag anymore. It was a holy relic. The wreckage of Esmond's plane washed up days later. His body was recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British Empire. The citation read simply, "For his high courage and splendid resolution." But the tragedy of the Channel Dash highlights the paradox of the Swordfish. Why did they fly it? Why did the British keep sending men out in canvas biplanes in 1942? Because it was the only thing that could fly. The weather that day was atrocious. The cloud ceiling was 500 feet. The modern torpedo bombers, the Beauforts, could not operate in that weather. They were too fast, and if they flew that low, they would crash. The Swordfish was the only aircraft capable of flying slow enough to see the ships in the mist. Its weakness, its lack of speed, was the only reason the British could attack at all. This leads us to the final, and perhaps most impressive chapter of the Swordfish's life. After the heroism of the Bismarck and the tragedy of the Channel, the plane reinvented itself again. It stopped hunting battleships and started hunting the invisible. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost. The U-boats were winning. Churchill was terrified. The air gap in the middle of the ocean was a slaughterhouse. Convoys were sinking faster than they could be built. The Admiralty needed air cover, but they had no carriers to spare. So, they built the MAC ships, merchant aircraft carriers. These were grain ships, or oil tankers, with a flat wooden deck bolted on top. Living on a MAC ship was a special kind of hell. The flight deck was tiny, only 400 feet long. The ship was full of explosive cargo, grain dust, or crude oil. If a torpedo hit a MAC ship, it did not sink. It exploded. And on these floating bombs lived the Swordfish crews. Flying from a MAC ship was a nightmare. The ship heaved in the Atlantic swell. To take off, the Swordfish had to rev its engine to maximum power while the brakes were held. Then, as the ship's bow dipped into a wave, the pilot would release the brakes. The plane would roll down the deck. The pilot had to time the liftoff perfectly with the ship's upward pitch. If he got it wrong, he would fly straight into a green wall of water. And landing? Landing a biplane on a 400-foot strip of wet wood moving at 10 knots in a gale requires the hands of a surgeon and the nerves of a drunkard. But the Swordfish loved it. Its low stall speed meant it could land on a handkerchief. And its open cockpit? The pilots finally found a use for it. Visibility. In a modern plane with a plexiglass canopy, rain and oil smear the glass. You cannot see anything. In the Swordfish, the pilot could lean his head out over the side. He could see the white foam of a periscope feather in the dark water. He could smell the diesel exhaust of a U-boat recharging its batteries. The Swordfish became the ultimate sentinel. It carried the new ASV radar, a bulky, primitive set that looked like a bed spring frame stuck between the wings. It carried the RP-3 rockets, a solid steel penetrators that could punch through a pressure hull. The U-boat crews hated them. They called them the White Ghosts. They would be running on the surface at night, safe in the darkness. Suddenly, a white biplane would drift out of the clouds, engine idling, silent as the grave. The rockets would fire. The hull would crack. The Atlantic would claim another crew. By 1944, the Swordfish was sinking more submarines than any other aircraft type. It turned the air gap from a hunting ground into a sanctuary, and it kept flying. While the Gloucester Meteor jet was entering service, the Swordfish was still launching from tankers. While the atomic bomb was being loaded, the Swordfish was still patrolling the convoy lanes. It was the aircraft that refused to be replaced. The Fairey Albacore was built to replace it. It was faster, enclosed, and modern. The pilots hated it. They wanted their stringbags back. The Albacore was retired before the Swordfish. The replacement died of old age, while the original kept fighting. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Royal Navy did a head count. The Swordfish had outlasted the enemies it fought. The Bismarck was rust. The Italian fleet was scrap. The U-boats were iron coffins. But the Stringbag was still airworthy. It is a lesson in engineering humility. We often think that better means newer. We think that advanced means complex. The Swordfish proves that sometimes better just means it works. It worked because it was simple. It worked because it was rugged. And it worked because the men who climbed into those open cockpits, wrapping scarves around their faces to fight the frostbite, were the hardest men to ever walk the earth. They knew they were flying a joke. They knew the enemy laughed at them. But as the crew of the Bismarck found out, and as the U-boat captains learned the hard way, the joke is not funny when it's carrying a torpedo with your name on it. We've seen the Swordfish cripple the Bismarck with a torpedo and illuminate the harbor of Taranto with flares. But as the war dragged into 1943, the enemy changed. The massive surface battleships were hiding in port. The new threat was the U-boat. And to kill a U-boat, a torpedo was often useless. You needed a weapon that did not swim. You needed a weapon that stabbed. This is the story of how the Stringbag became the rocket spear. By 1943, the engineers at Fairey Aviation were looking at the Swordfish the way a mechanic looks at a 1920s tractor that refuses to die. The Air Ministry kept asking for more. Can it carry radar? Can it carry flares? Can it carry depth charges? The answer was always yes, provided you did not mind taking off at the speed of a bicycle. But the U-boat war required a new kind of violence. Depth charges were clumsy. They were essentially barrels of explosives that you rolled off the back of a ship or dropped from a plane. You had to guess where the submarine was in 3 dimensions. If you set the fuse for 50 feet and the sub was at 100 feet, you just gave the German crew a headache. If you missed by 20 yards, the water cushioned the blow. The Royal Navy needed a sniper rifle. They needed a weapon that could hit a surfacing submarine and punch a hole through the pressure hull before the crew could button the hatch. They found the answer in the RP-3 rocket projectile. These were ugly weapons. They were 60-pound warheads screwed onto a solid steel tube filled with cordite. They had no guidance system, no electronics. They were dumb rockets. On a modern fighter like the Typhoon, they were used to blow up tanks. But someone had the bright idea to bolt steel rails under the lower wings of the Swordfish, right through the fabric, and hang 8 of these iron bars on the biplane. It looked ridiculous. The Swordfish was already aerodynamic chaos. Adding 8 rockets made it look like a flying junkyard. But when the test pilots fired them, they realized something terrifying. Because the Swordfish was so slow and stable, it was the perfect launch platform. A fast fighter plane shakes and vibrates. The Swordfish glided. It was like shooting from a tripod. On May 23, 1943, the rocket spear was blooded. The Swordfish was flying from the escort carrier HMS Archer. The pilot, Sub-Lieutenant Horrocks, was patrolling the Atlantic Gap. The weather was standard: low clouds, gray water, visibility crap. Then, the radar blip appeared. It was U-752, a Type 7 German U-boat. The crew was on deck, enjoying a smoke, confident that they were far from land-based bombers. They saw the biplane coming out of the clouds. They scrambled for the quad 20mm flat gun. They expected a depth charge run, a flyover where the pilot drops a barrel and prays. Horrocks did not fly over. He dove. The physics of a rocket attack in a biplane are intense. If you fire the rockets too slow, they drop like stones. If you fire them too fast, you risk blowing your own propeller off with the debris. Horrocks pushed the nose down. The wires screamed. The German gunners opened fire. Tracers zipped through the wings. At 400 yards, Horrocks pressed the button. The rails under the wings ignited. Whoosh! Whoosh! The rockets accelerated to 1,000 feet per second. They did not hit the water. They hit the steel. One rocket punched through the U-boat's pressure hole, just below the waterline. Another smashed into the ballast tanks. The effect was instantaneous. A depth charge relies on a shock wave to crush the hull. A rocket relies on kinetic energy and a shaped charge to pierce it. The rocket turned the U-752 into a sieve. The German captain tried to crash dive, but you cannot dive when your hull has a hole the size of a dinner plate. The ocean rushed in. The batteries shorted out. The sub lurched to the surface, dead in the water, bleeding oil. The crew abandoned ship. It was the first time in history that a submarine had been destroyed by aircraft rockets. And the Executioner was a plane that had been designed before the rockets were even invented. This success created a strange problem for the Royal Navy. They had spent millions of pounds developing a replacement for the Swordfish. It was called the Fairey Albacore. The Albacore was supposed to be the Swordfish 2.0. It was sleek. It had an enclosed cockpit with a heater. It had a more powerful Taurus engine. It had hydraulic flaps. It was, on paper, superior in every way. The Admiralty ordered hundreds of them. They sent them to the squadrons. They told the pilots, "Good news, boys. You can retire the Stringbags. Here is the future." The pilots hated it. They climbed into the Albacore and felt trapped. The enclosed cockpit was nice for warmth, but terrible for war. The glass fogged up. You could not lean out to see the landing deck. You could not smell the enemy. And the engine? The Taurus engine was a high-tech nightmare. It was temperamental. It broke down. But the biggest insult was the handling. The Swordfish was light and responsive. You could throw it around the sky. The Albacore was heavy. It wallowed. It felt like driving a bus compared to riding a bicycle. The pilots rebelled. They wrote reports saying the improvement was a death trap. They begged for their old planes back. And in a twist of irony that sums up the entire Swordfish story, the replacement failed. The Albacore was retired from service in 1943. The Swordfish? It kept flying until 1945. The grandfather buried the grandson. The obsolete plane attended the funeral of the modern plane and then went back to work killing submarines. And the work was getting harder. As the war moved into the Arctic, the Swordfish crews faced an enemy worse than the Germans: the cold. The Arctic convoys to Russia were the most dangerous shipping routes of the war. Ships had to sail from Scotland, around occupied Norway, to Murmansk. The air temperature was often 30 degrees below zero. The spray from the ocean would freeze on the deck, adding hundreds of tons of ice to the ships, threatening to capsize them. The Swordfish operated from the escort carriers like HMS Chaser and Tracker in these conditions. Imagine the physical torture. You are sitting in an open cockpit. You are wearing 3 layers of wool, a leather flying suit, and a zoot suit, a rubber immersion suit. You look like the Michelin Man. You can barely move your arms. The wind chill at 80 knots is -60 degrees. If you touch a metal part of the plane with bare skin, your flesh bonds to it instantly. If you cry, your tears freeze on your cheeks. The mechanics had it even worse. To start the Pegasus engine in the Arctic, they had to dilute the oil with gasoline so it would not turn into a solid block of sludge. They had to use blow torches to warm the cylinders. They worked on the open deck, in a gale, with frozen fingers, loading 1,600-pound torpedoes, or racks of rockets. And yet, they flew. In one legendary incident during convoy RA-58, the Swordfish from HMS Activity flew for 5 days straight in a blizzard. The flight deck pitched 40 feet up and down. The pilots had to land on a moving strip of ice. They sank 3 U-boats in 1 week. The German U-boat crews were terrified of the Arctic Swordfish. In the Atlantic, they could sometimes spot a patrol plane from miles away. In the Arctic gloom and snow, the Swordfish was invisible. It was a white ghost. There's a story of a swordfish pilot named Winkle Brown, who would go on to become the world's greatest test pilot. He landed a swordfish on a carrier deck that was pitching so badly the propeller chopped into the wooden deck planks on the downswing. The landing gear collapsed. The plane skidded to a halt. Brown climbed out, unhurt. The deck crew ran up to apologize. Brown looked at the shattered propeller and the broken struts. Then he looked at the fuselage. The fabric was torn, but the frame was straight. "Drag it below," he said. "Give me a new prop and some duct tape. I'm going back up." That was the spirit of the Stringbag. It was a machine that simply refused to accept that it was broken. But the ultimate humiliation for the Axis powers came in the form of the MAC ships we mentioned earlier, the merchant aircraft carriers. The Germans had battleships. They had U-boats. They had the Luftwaffe. The British had grain ships. The Empire Mac Alpine was a grain carrier. It hauled thousands of tons of wheat from Canada to Liverpool. But it also had a flight deck bolted on top and a hangar in the rear. It carried 4 swordfish. The pilots were Navy, but the ship's crew were civilians, merchant sailors. They did not salute. They wore jeans and sweaters. They ate better food than the Navy. It was a bizarre culture clash. You had elite naval aviators living next to roughneck dock workers. But it worked. The Swordfish operating from these grain ships closed the air gap. They made it impossible for a U-boat to surface and recharge its batteries during the day. They forced the submarines to stay submerged, crawling at 2 knots, using up their oxygen. By 1944, the U-boat arm was breaking. The crews were exhausted. They were being hunted by everything from long-range liberators to these buzzing, stinging biplanes. One German prisoner, pulled from the water after his sub was rocketed by a swordfish, looked at the plane circling overhead. He asked his captors, "What is that secret weapon?" The British sailor laughed. That's not a secret weapon, mate. That's my grandmother's knitting bag." The prisoner shook his head. He could not believe he had been defeated by an antique. As 1945 approached, the Swordfish began to hunt a new target. The Germans were sending midget submarines, 2-man suicide vessels, to attack the invasion fleets off Belgium and the Netherlands. These tiny subs were hard to spot on radar, and so the Swordfish crews went back to Mark I eyeball tactics. They flew at night, looking for the phosphorescent wake of the midget subs. It was the only aircraft slow enough to track them. In the final months of the war, while jet fighters were screaming over Berlin at 500 miles per hour, the Swordfish was potting midget subs in the English Channel at 90 miles per hour. It was a poetic end to the conflict. The war had started with biplanes, and it was ending with biplanes. The Swordfish had come full circle. It had destroyed the biggest ship in the German Navy, Bismarck, and the smallest, the midget subs. It had destroyed the Italian fleet at anchor, and it had saved the convoys. And it had done it all without a heater, and without a modern radio, and without a single piece of armor plating. When the order finally came to stand down, the pilots felt a strange sadness. They looked at their battered stringbags. The fabric was patched in 100 places. The paint was faded by the Atlantic salt. The engines leaked oil. They were not pretty. They were not fast. But they were alive. The pilots patted the cowlings. They knew they would never fly anything like it again. They were moving on to the age of jets and pressurized cockpits. They were trading the wind in their face for air-conditioned bubbles. They were trading the visceral, terrifying, exhilarating experience of the Stringbag for the sterile efficiency of the future. But before we close the book on this legend, we have to look at the numbers. Because the math of the Swordfish is the most impossible part of the story. The production cost of a Swordfish, approximately 5,000 pounds. Cost of the Bismarck, 200 million pounds, adjusted. Cost of the Italian fleet, billions. Value of the convoys saved, incalculable. It was the most cost-effective weapon in the history of warfare. It delivered a return on investment that would make a Wall Street banker weep with joy. And it serves as a permanent reminder to every engineer, every general, and every armchair expert. Complexity is not superiority. Just because something is new does not mean it's better. And just because something looks like a joke does not mean it cannot kill you. The Stringbag was a joke that stopped laughing and started killing. And it did not stop until the ocean was safe. When the sun set on the British Empire in 1945, the Royal Navy took stock of its inventory. They had thousands of aircraft. They had shiny new American Corsairs with gull wings and massive engines. They had Supermarine Seafires that could climb like rockets. They had the first generation of jet fighters entering service. And sitting in the corner of the hangars, dripping oil and smelling of wet canvas, were the Swordfish. By all logic, these planes should have been scrapped in 1941. They were supposed to be replaced by the Albacore. Then they were supposed to be replaced by the Barracuda. But like a loyal old dog that refuses to die, the Swordfish had outlived them all. It remained the standard torpedo bomber of the fleet until the very last day of hostilities. But peace is ruthless. In war, you use whatever works. In peace, you use what is efficient. And a biplane that flies at 90 miles per hour is not efficient. The scrapping began. It was not done with malice. It was done with indifference. The Swordfish were dragged out of the hangars. The wings were folded back, one of the plane's cleverest design features, allowing it to fit on tiny carrier elevators, and they were towed to the burning pits. The fabric was stripped off. The wooden ribs were smashed. The metal frames were cut up for scrap. The Bristol Pegasus engines, those reliable, rattling hearts that had pulled men through Arctic blizzards and Atlantic gales, were melted down to make toasters and cars. It was a quiet end for a giant killer. There were no parades for the Stringbag. The Spitfire got the flypasts. The Lancaster got the movies. The Swordfish just faded away. But history has a way of correcting its mistakes. As the years went by, historians and pilots started looking back at the statistics of the war. They started crunching the numbers, and they realized something shocking. The Swordfish had sunk more tonnage of Axis shipping than any other Allied aircraft type. Period. It was not the heavy bombers. It was not the fast attack planes. It was the Stringbag. It had crippled the Italian fleet. It had doomed the Bismarck. It had strangled the U-boat wolf packs. It had protected the Arctic convoys. If you remove the Swordfish from the timeline of World War II, the war changes instantly. Without Taranto, the Royal Navy loses the Mediterranean. Without the Bismarck sinking, the Atlantic supply lines are severed. Without the U-boat patrols from the Mac ships, Britain starves in 1943. This obsolete toy was the linchpin of the Allied victory at sea. Today, there are only a handful of Swordfish left in the world. The most famous ones belong to the Royal Navy Historic Flight. If you ever get the chance to see one at an air show, do not just walk past it to look at the jets. Stop. Look closely. You will be shocked by how fragile it looks. The fabric skin is tight like a drum. You can see the outline of the ribs underneath. The cockpit is laughably exposed. There's no glass bubble, no heater, no ejection seat, just a leather rim and a wicker chair. When the engine starts, it does not scream like a jet. It coughs, it pops, it spits blue smoke. It sounds like a tractor. As it taxis by, the wings bounce and wobble. It looks like it's going to fall apart before it even takes off. But then, watch it fly. It lifts off in a few hundred feet. It hangs in the air, defying gravity not with speed, but with lift. It turns on a dime. It is slow, graceful, and utterly unthreatening. And that is the terrifying paradox. Imagine being a German sailor on the deck of the Bismarck. You are on the most powerful warship ever built. You have 15-inch guns. You are the master of the ocean. And then you look up and see that. You see a biplane that looks like it belongs in a museum. You laugh. You think it's a joke. And 10 minutes later, your steering gear is jammed. Your ship is circling in death throes, and your empire is crumbling. The Swordfish teaches us the most important lesson of military history. Capability is not the same as complexity. We live in an age of billion-dollar stealth fighters and hypersonic missiles. We are obsessed with the bleeding edge. We think that if a weapon is not digital, it's useless. The Swordfish laughs at that idea. It proves that sometimes the best weapon is simply the one that works in the worst conditions. It worked because it was simple. A bullet through the wing did not sever a hydraulic line. It just made a hole in the cloth. A rough landing did not crack a carbon fiber spar. It just bent a steel tube that a mechanic could hammer straight. It could be fixed by a teenager with a wrench in a freezing gale. But the machine is only half the story. The other half is the men. We have to talk about the open cockpit generation. The men who flew the Swordfish were a different breed. They did not have the ego of the fighter pilots. They did not have the comfort of the bomber crews. They were naval aviators who accepted that their job was to fly slow, low, and straight into the guns. They flew in weather that grounded birds. They flew with frostbite on their faces. They flew knowing that if they ditched in the Arctic, they had 3 minutes to live before the cold stopped their hearts. And they did it with a dark, uniquely British sense of humor. They embraced the absurdity of their plane. They wore their stringbag status like a badge of honor. They knew they were flying an antique, and they took a perverse pride in using that antique to destroy the master race. There is a story of a Swordfish pilot who, after sinking a U-boat, flew over the survivors in the water. He did not strafe them. He dropped a package. It was a life raft and a bottle of rum. It was a gesture from a different era, a moment of chivalry in a brutal war. It was the Stringbag way. So, how should we remember this plane? Well, it should not be remembered as a curiosity. Well, it should not be a footnote. It should be remembered as the ultimate underdog. The Fairey Swordfish is the Rocky Balboa of aviation. It was slow. It was ugly. It talked funny. It got beaten up in every fight. But it did not hear the bell. It kept coming forward. It kept throwing punches. And in the end, it was the one standing over the knockout body of the Axis Navy. It connects the dots of the entire war. Remember Lieutenant Commander Naito, the Japanese attaché, who watched the Swordfish destroy the Italian fleet at Taranto? He sent that report to Tokyo. Admiral Yamamoto read it. He saw that torpedoes could be dropped in shallow water. He used that lesson to plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Swordfish did not just save Britain. It inadvertently taught Japan how to start the Pacific War. Its fingerprint is on every major naval event of the 1940s. As we close the hangar doors on this story, take a moment to appreciate the silence. The roar of the Bismarck's guns is gone. The scream of the Stukas is gone. The Atlantic is quiet. But if you listen closely to the history, you can still hear it. The faint, rhythmic chug, chug, chug of a Pegasus engine. The whistle of the wind in the bracing wires. The sound of a canvas kite flying into the storm. It is the sound of courage. It is the sound of the Stringbag. And it reminds us that you do not need to be the fastest, the strongest, or the most advanced to change the world. You just need to be there. You need to hold your course. And when the giant is looking the other way, you need to drop the torpedo. And now, I have a mission for you. History was not just written in the skies over Europe. It lives in the towns and cities where you are sitting right now. The spirit that drove those pilots into the gale lives on. I want you to drop your city and state in the comments right now. And here is the final question for the true historians in the comments. If you had to choose one mission, flying a swordfish against the Bismarck in a storm, or flying a mosquito against the prison wall at 50 feet, which one do you take? Which suicide run takes more guts?